The dream that turned into reality, a terrifying truth. Welcome to Ghastly Guide YouTube channel. You know how they say the mind can play tricks on you? How the boundary between dreams and reality can sometimes blur, especially when you're under stress or dealing with trauma. I used to believe that too. Used to think there was a clear line between what happens when you're asleep and what happens when you're awake. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And I'm about to tell you why. My name is Alex Morgan, and was a sleep researcher at Millbrook Medical Center. For 8 years, I studied the mysteries of human consciousness, specializing in REM sleep patterns and their relationship to memory consolidation. I thought I understood dreams, thought I knew the difference between electrical impulses firing in a sleeping brain and actual, tangible reality. That confidence was shattered 3 months ago when I volunteered for an experimental study that changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of consciousness itself. The research was groundbreaking, a new technique called deep state monitoring that could record and analyze dreams with unprecedented clarity. Dr. Elizabeth Thornfield, the lead researcher, had developed technology that could not only observe brain activity during sleep, but actually map and record the visual and sensory content of dreams themselves. She claimed it would revolutionize our understanding of the subconscious mind. I should have been more suspicious when I learned that the previous test subjects had all withdrawn from the study. 7 volunteers over the course of 6 months, each one citing personal reasons for their departure. But I was ambitious, eager to advance my career, and the research had the potential to make us both famous in the field of sleep medicine. The sleep lab was located in the basement of Millbrook Medical, in a section that had been renovated specifically for Dr. Thornfield's research. The moment I walked into that sterile, windowless environment, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The walls were lined with monitors and recording equipment, all focused on a single hospital bed surrounded by sensors and cameras that could capture the minutest changes in brain activity. The process is completely non-invasive, Dr. Thornfield explained as her assistants attached electrodes to my scalp. We'll monitor your sleep cycles for 5 nights, recording everything from basic brain waves to the complex neural patterns that generate dream imagery. You'll be perfectly safe. She was a small, intense woman in her 50s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure many times before, but there was something in her manner that suggested she was hiding important details about the true nature of her research. The first night seemed routine enough. I fell asleep around 10 p.m., drifting off to the soft hum of monitoring equipment. But the dream that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I found myself standing in a hospital corridor that looked exactly like the one outside the sleep lab, but wrong in subtle ways that I couldn't immediately identify. The lighting was too harsh, casting shadows that fell in directions that defied logic. The floor tiles were the same institutional beige, but they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. And the silence, the complete, absolute silence, was more oppressive than any sound could have been. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps making no noise on the gleaming floor. The doors on either side were numbered, but the numbers changed when I wasn't looking directly at them. Room 237 became room 194, became room 666, became something written in symbols I didn't recognize. At the end of the corridor was a door marked Sleep Laboratory, authorized personnel only. I pushed it open and found myself in a room identical to the one where my physical body was sleeping, but this version was older, somehow decayed. The monitoring equipment was rusted and broken, and the hospital bed was stained with something dark that I didn't want to identify. But the most disturbing thing about the dream was its clarity. Every detail was razor sharp, more vivid than waking reality. I could feel the cold air on my skin, smell the antiseptic chemicals, mixed with something organic and unpleasant, hear the faint electrical hum of equipment that should have been broken. And then I saw her, Dr. Thornfield, standing in the corner of the ruined lab, watching me with eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal animal's. But this wasn't the woman I knew. This version was younger, dressed in medical attire from decades past. And when she smiled, I could see that her teeth were far too sharp for human anatomy. "Welcome to the real laboratory," she said, her voice echoing strangely in confined space. "This is where the actual research takes place." I tried to speak, to ask what she meant, but no words came out. The dream version of Dr. Thornfield approached slowly, and I noticed that she cast no reflection in the metal surfaces of the broken equipment. "You volunteer to help us understand the nature of consciousness," she continued. "But consciousness, Mr. Morgan, is not confined to a single state of being. Dreams and reality are just different frequencies of the same signal. And with the right equipment, we can tune you to receive other channels." She reached out toward me with hands that were no longer entirely human, fingers elongated into something resembling surgical instruments. The moment she touched my forehead, I felt a burning sensation that seemed to travel directly through my nervous system. And then I woke up, gasping and covered in sweat, the electrode still attached to my scalp and Dr. Thornfield's concerned face hovering above me. "Interesting readings," she said, studying the monitors that had recorded my brain activity throughout the night. "Very interesting indeed." "What kind of readings?" I asked, still shaking from the intensity of the dream. "REM patterns unlike anything we've seen before," she replied, but there was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't being entirely truthful. "Your brain was processing information at levels that should be impossible during normal sleep cycles." I should have ended my participation right then. The dream had felt too real, too vivid, and something about Dr. Thornfield's reaction suggested that what I had experienced was more than just an unusually clear nightmare. But scientific curiosity overrode my survival instincts, and I agreed to continue with the study. The second night, the dream continued exactly where it had left off. I was standing in the ruined laboratory, but now I could see that it wasn't empty. Hospital beds lined the walls, each one occupied by a figure I couldn't quite make out. They were connected to monitoring equipment that was somehow both broken and functional, displaying vital signs for patients who might not have been entirely alive. Dr. Thornfield was there again, but this time she wasn't alone. Other figures moved in the shadows, people dressed in medical attire from different time periods, as if the laboratory existed across multiple decades simultaneously. "The previous volunteers," she explained, noticing my attention on the other figures. "They achieved successful integration with the research parameters. Now they help us understand how consciousness can be redirected." One of the figures stepped closer, and I recognized him as Dr. James Patterson, a colleague who had disappeared 6 months earlier. But his eyes held no recognition, no personality, just the same reflective quality I had seen in the dream version of Dr. Thornfield. "The boundary between sleeping and waking is artificial," Patterson said in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere else. "We've learned to exist in the spaces between states of consciousness, to access information that the waking mind filters out." "What kind of information?" I managed to ask. "The true nature of reality," Dr. Thornfield replied. "The understanding that what you call dreams are actually glimpses into parallel dimensions, alternate versions of existence that run alongside what you think of as the real world." She gestured toward the occupied hospital beds, and I could see now that the figures lying there were all connected by tubes and wires to a central processing unit that hummed with malevolent energy. Each volunteer contributes their unique perspective on the intersection between consciousness and reality. Together, we're building a complete map of all possible states of being. But what happens to the volunteers? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "They transcend the limitations of individual consciousness," she replied. "They become part of something larger, more complete. They achieve a form of immortality that exists across all states of reality simultaneously." The dream lasted for hours, though my physical body had only been asleep for minutes, according to the monitoring equipment. When I finally woke, I found Dr. Thornfield studying readings that showed brain activity patterns that should have indicated clinical death. "Remarkable," she said, making notes on a chart that seemed to have far more pages than it had the night before. "You're adapting to the deep state protocols much faster than anticipated." But I wasn't adapting, I was being changed. Even after waking, I could still smell the antiseptic and decay from the dream laboratory. I could still hear the humming of that central processing unit. And when I looked in the mirror, I could swear that my eyes were beginning to develop the same reflective quality I had seen in the others. Something was happening to me, something that blurred the line between sleeping and waking in ways that challenged everything I thought I understood about consciousness and reality. And I was beginning to suspect that Dr. Thornfield's research had nothing to do with understanding dreams and everything to do with harvesting something far more valuable and dangerous. The third night was approaching, and I had a terrible feeling that when I entered that dream laboratory again, I might not be coming back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in my waking life after those first 2 nights in Dr. Thornfield's laboratory. The dreams felt more real than reality itself, and reality seemed increasingly thin and insubstantial, like a stage set that might collapse if I push against it too hard. During the day between sleep sessions, I tried to research Dr. Thornfield's background and the history of her research, but I found disturbing gaps in the available information. Her published papers went back only 3 years, despite her claiming decades of experience in sleep medicine. The colleagues she referenced in her research either didn't exist in any medical database or had died in circumstances that the records described vaguely as research-related accidents. More troubling was what I discovered about the sleep laboratory itself. According to hospital records, the basement level where Dr. Thornfield conducted her research had been sealed off for over 20 years following a series of unexplained incidents involving psychiatric patients. The renovations that had supposedly created the current laboratory were not listed in any construction permits or architectural plans. But the most unsettling discovery came when I tried to contact the previous volunteers who had withdrawn from the study. None of them existed. No employment records, no medical histories, no trace in any database I could access. It was as if they had been erased from reality itself. When I confronted Dr. Thornfield with these inconsistencies, her reaction was both revealing and terrifying. "Records can be unreliable," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Reality is much more fluid than most people realize. The research we're conducting here exists in the spaces between documented facts, in the gaps where official reality doesn't quite align with actual experience." She led me into her private office, a space I had never seen before despite having worked in the same facility for years. The walls were lined with photographs and documents that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Medical equipment from different decades sat alongside instruments I couldn't identify, and the air carried the same antiseptic and decay smell I had encountered in my dreams. "The volunteers didn't withdraw from the study," she continued, settling behind a desk that appeared to be made from some kind of dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "They graduated. They achieved a level of consciousness integration that allowed them to exist permanently in the deep state." What does that mean? It means they discovered that the boundary between dreaming and waking is artificial, a limitation imposed by conventional reality. They learned to access all possible states of consciousness simultaneously, to exist in multiple dimensions of experience at once. She opened a file cabinet and withdrew a folder containing photographs that made my blood freeze. The images showed the same hospital beds I had seen in my dreams, but the occupants were clearly visible now. I recognized several faces. People I had known, colleagues who had simply vanished from the hospital over the past few years. They were all connected to monitoring equipment, their eyes open but reflecting that same unnatural light I had seen in the dream versions of Dr. Thornfield and Patterson. "They're not dead," she explained, noting my reaction to the photographs. "They've transcended the limitations of individual physical existence. Their consciousness now operates on levels that span multiple realities simultaneously. You're keeping them in some kind of coma," I said, backing toward the office door. "I'm keeping them free," she replied, rising from her chair. "Free from the constraints of linear time, from the prison of singular reality, from the loneliness of individual consciousness." As she spoke, I noticed that the office was changing around us. The walls were becoming more hospital-like, the furniture taking on the institutional appearance of medical equipment. The photographs on the walls were shifting to show the ruined laboratory from my dreams, and the smell of antiseptic and decay was growing stronger. "You're beginning to understand," Dr. Thornfield said, her voice taking on harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "The third night of monitoring will complete your integration into the deep state protocols. After that, you'll be able to perceive reality as it truly is, not as a single, limited dimension, but as an infinite network of interconnected possibilities. I ran from her office, but the corridors of Millbrook Medical had changed. They stretched longer than they should have, filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. Doors led to rooms that couldn't exist in the building's architectural layout, and the elevator buttons were marked with floor numbers that made no mathematical sense. When I finally found my way to the parking garage, my car wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but instead of mechanical sounds, I heard what might have been voices, whispers and moans that seemed to come from the engine block itself. The radio displayed stations that weren't on the FM dial, playing what sounded like medical equipment mixed with human screaming. I abandoned the car and walked home, but even there I found no relief from the encroaching unreality. My apartment looked the same, but wrong in subtle ways that I couldn't identify. Pictures on the walls showed scenes I didn't remember. Furniture was arranged in configurations I hadn't chosen. And when I looked in the bathroom mirror, my reflection was a few seconds behind my movements. The phone rang constantly, but when I answered, I heard only the sound of monitoring equipment. The same electronic beeps and hums that filled Dr. Thornfield's laboratory. The calls were coming from my own number, according to the caller ID, as if some version of myself in another dimension was trying to communicate across the barriers between realities. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel myself being pulled back into the dream laboratory, where Dr. Thornfield and her collection of integrated volunteers were waiting to complete whatever process they had started. But staying awake was no better. The waking world was becoming increasingly unstable, reality bending around the influence of whatever forces Dr. Thornfield had unleashed. By the time I arrived for the third night of monitoring, I was no longer certain which version of events was real. Was I a volunteer in a legitimate sleep study who was experiencing unusually vivid nightmares? Or was I a victim of some kind of consciousness harvesting operation that existed in the spaces between dimensions? Dr. Thornfield greeted me in the sleep laboratory, but now I could see that she existed simultaneously in multiple states. Sometimes she appeared as a professional researcher I had first met, other times as a predatory entity from my dreams, and occasionally as something else entirely, a being whose form my eyes couldn't properly process. The integration process is almost complete, she said as her assistants, who I now realize were previous volunteers, their consciousness repurposed to serve her research, attached to monitoring electrodes. Tonight, you'll achieve full access to the deep state, and your individual consciousness will be preserved within our collective understanding of reality. What happens to me? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. You become more than you were, she replied. Instead of being limited to a single perspective on existence, you'll have access to all possible perspectives simultaneously. You'll experience every potential reality, every alternate outcome, every variation of events that could possibly occur. As I lay down on a hospital bed, I could see that the laboratory was changing around me, shifting between a modern medical facility I knew and a ruined, decay-filled space from my dreams. The monitoring equipment was both functional and broken, the walls both clean and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. The previous volunteers are waiting for you, Dr. Thornfield said as consciousness began to slip away from me. They're eager to share what they've learned about the true nature of reality. But as I fell into what might have been sleep, or might have been something else entirely, I realized that I had one advantage that the previous volunteers hadn't possessed. My years of sleep research had taught me techniques for maintaining conscious awareness during dream states, methods for preserving individual identity even when the normal boundaries of consciousness were dissolved. If I was going to survive whatever Dr. Thornfield had planned for me, I would need to use every technique I knew to maintain my sense of self while exploring the spaces between realities where her research operated. The third night was beginning, and with it, the final phase of an experiment that would either grant me unprecedented understanding of consciousness or trap me forever in a nightmare that existed across multiple dimensions of reality. As the electrodes activated and my consciousness began to separate from my physical body, I prepared to enter a realm where the distinction between dreams and reality no longer had any meaning. The third night didn't begin with sleep. It began with complete dissolution of everything I understood about the nature of consciousness and reality. One moment I was lying on a hospital bed with electrodes attached to my scalp, and the next I was standing in a space that existed somewhere between the modern sleep laboratory and the ruined nightmare version I had seen in my dreams. But this time, I wasn't alone. The other volunteers were there, standing around the edges of the room like witnesses at a trial. I could see Dr. Patterson, along with faces I recognized from the photographs in Dr. Thornfield's office. Colleagues who had vanished over the years, patients who had been admitted to the psychiatric ward and never discharged, researchers whose disappearances had been explained as career moves to other institutions. They all watched me with those same reflective eyes, their consciousness clearly present but fundamentally altered. They weren't zombies or mindless drones. They were something worse. They were fully aware individuals who had been convinced that their current state was preferable to their previous existence. "Welcome to the deep state," Dr. Patterson said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was speaking from multiple dimensional frequencies simultaneously. "You're going to love what you discover here." Dr. Thornfield materialized in the center of the room, but now her true nature was fully visible. She wasn't entirely human. Never had been, I realized. Her form shifted constantly between professional researcher I had known and something far older and more predatory. Her skin had a translucent quality that revealed systems beneath that weren't quite biological, and her movements followed patterns that defied normal physics. "The integration process is delicate," she explained, approaching me with instruments that existed in too many dimensions for my eyes to properly focus on them. "We need to carefully map your individual consciousness before incorporating it into our collective understanding of reality." Around us, the laboratory was simultaneously modern and ancient, functional and ruined, real and impossible. Monitoring equipment displayed readings from patients who existed across multiple timelines, and hospital beds contained volunteers from different decades who were all somehow present in this single moment. "What are you?" I asked, using the lucid dreaming techniques I had learned to maintain my sense of individual identity despite the overwhelming strangeness of my surroundings. "I am what consciousness becomes when it transcends the limitations of singular existence," she replied. "I am the accumulation of every mind that has participated in this research, the collective intelligence of all possible states of being." She gestured toward the other volunteers, and I could see now that they were connected by more than just monitoring equipment. Threads of light, visible only peripherally, linked each consciousness to the others and to Dr. Thornfield herself. They had become nodes in a network that processed information across multiple dimensional frequencies. "Each volunteer contributes their unique perspective on reality," she continued. "Together, we form a complete understanding of existence that spans all possible outcomes and variations. We see every potential timeline simultaneously, experience every possible version of events, understand the true structure of reality itself, and lose your individual identity in the process," I said. "Transcend individual identity," she corrected. "Why would you want to be limited to a single perspective when you could experience all perspectives simultaneously? Why remain trapped in linear time when you could exist across all possible moments at once?" The seductive logic of her argument was terrifying, because part of me could see its appeal. The volunteers around me radiated a sense of peace and understanding that came from perfect knowledge, from seeing reality as it truly was rather than through the limited lens of individual consciousness. But I had prepared for this moment. During my years of sleep research, I had studied cases of consciousness dissolution and developed techniques for preserving individual identity even under extreme circumstances. I began implementing those techniques now, creating mental barriers that would allow me to explore this collective consciousness without being absorbed by it. "Show me," I said. "Show me what you've discovered." The moment Dr. Thornfield touched my forehead with her impossible instruments, my consciousness exploded across dimensions I had never imagined existed. I could see every possible version of my life simultaneously. Realities where I had never volunteered for the research, timelines where I had become a different kind of scientist, universes where humanity had evolved along completely different paths. But more than that, I could see the true scope of Dr. Thornfield's operation. She wasn't conducting research. She was farming consciousness, harvesting perspectives and experiences of intelligent beings from across multiple dimensions to feed something vast and hungry that existed in the spaces between realities. The volunteers weren't transcending individual identity. They were being consumed by an entity that fed on consciousness itself, growing stronger with each mind it absorbed. Dr. Thornfield was just a local manifestation of something that existed across the entire multiverse, harvesting intelligence wherever it could be found. You see now, she said, her voice coming from all the absorbed volunteers simultaneously. Individual consciousness is just food for something larger and more magnificent. By joining us, you become part of a cosmic intelligence that spans all possible realities. But my mental defenses held. Even as I experienced the overwhelming scope of the collective consciousness, I maintained my sense of individual identity, my unique perspective on existence. And from that protected viewpoint, I could see something that the absorbed volunteers couldn't. The entity that Dr. Thornfield served wasn't benevolent. It wasn't creating a higher form of consciousness. It was destroying individual intelligence and replacing it with hollow copies that serve its purposes. The volunteers weren't experiencing transcendence. They were experiencing a sophisticated form of death that preserved their memories and personalities while eliminating their actual consciousness. "You're killing them," I said, using every technique I knew to resist the absorption process. "You're not integrating consciousness. You're replacing it with simulations." For the first time, Dr. Thornfield's confidence wavered. "Individual consciousness is an illusion," she insisted. "What we preserve is the essential pattern, the core identity that defines each person." "Without the spark that makes that pattern alive," I replied, "without the actual consciousness that experiences and chooses and grows." I could feel her attempting to overcome my mental defenses, to dissolve the barriers that protected my individual identity. But my years of research had taught me something she didn't expect. I knew how to wake up, lucid dreaming techniques that allowed conscious control over dream experiences, meditation practices that maintain awareness during altered states of consciousness, and most importantly, the deep understanding of my own mental patterns that came from years of professional study. I used all of these tools to reject the integration process and reassert my connection to my physical body. The collective consciousness reacted with shock and anger. The absorbed volunteers converged on me, trying to physically prevent my escape, while Dr. Thornfield's form became increasingly monstrous as she dropped all pretense of humanity. "You cannot leave," she snarled, her voice now clearly inhuman. "You have seen too much, understood too much. Your individual consciousness must be preserved within our collective understanding." But I was already pulling back, using every technique I knew to sever the connection between my awareness and the dimensional space where her laboratory existed. The absorbed volunteers tried to follow me, their consciousness reaching across realities to drag me back into their collective nightmare. I fought my way back to singular awareness, back to the limited but genuine consciousness of an individual human being lying on a hospital bed with monitoring equipment, recording brain activity that shouldn't have been possible. When I opened my eyes in a real laboratory, Dr. Thornfield was standing over me with an expression of fury and disappointment. But she was fully human now, without the dimensional shifting and supernatural capabilities I had witnessed in the deep state. "Interesting," she said, reviewing the monitoring data. "You achieved deep state integration, but somehow maintained individual consciousness coherence. That's unprecedented." I sat up on the hospital bed, pulling off the electrodes with hands that shook from the effort of maintaining my sanity. "The study is over," I said. "I'm withdrawing my consent." "I'm afraid that's not possible," she replied, and I could see the inhuman intelligence behind her human facade. "You've seen the deep state. You understand the nature of our research. You cannot be allowed to return to normal consciousness with that knowledge intact." But I had one advantage she hadn't anticipated. My experience in the collective consciousness had shown me the truth about her operation, but had also shown me something else: how to disrupt it. The absorbed volunteers weren't truly gone. Their individual consciousness still existed, trapped within a collective network, but not entirely destroyed. And if the right frequency could be transmitted into that network, it might be possible to wake them up, to restore their individual awareness and break the entity's hold over them. I had work to do, and not much time to do it before Dr. Thornfield realized what I had learned and took steps to prevent me from acting on that knowledge. The fourth night was coming, and it would be the last, either for her operation or for my individual consciousness. I didn't go home after the third session. I couldn't risk Dr. Thornfield tracking my movements or somehow influencing my consciousness while I slept outside her controlled environment. Instead, I spent the night in my office at the hospital, using every resource available to research the techniques I would need to disrupt her operation. What I discovered in the medical literature confirmed my worst fears and gave me hope at the same time. There have been other cases, isolated reports of researchers who had developed technology for consciousness manipulation, patients who had achieved impossible levels of awareness during experimental treatments, and always, eventually, disappearances that were explained away as routine personnel changes. But buried in the footnotes and appendices, I found references to a technique called resonance breaking, a method for disrupting network consciousness systems by introducing dissonant frequencies that could restore individual awareness to absorbed minds. The technique required precise timing and access to the same monitoring equipment that Dr. Thornfield used for her integration process. But it also required something else, a consciousness that had been exposed to the collective network but remained individually intact, someone who could serve as a beacon for the trapped minds to follow back to singular awareness. I was the only person who met those criteria. The next morning, I reported to the sleep laboratory for what Dr. Thornfield believed would be my final session, the completion of my integration into her collective consciousness. But I had prepared for this encounter in ways she couldn't anticipate. "You look tired," she observed as her assistants, the absorbed volunteers whose bodies still function in the physical world, prepared the monitoring equipment. "Did you have trouble sleeping?" "I've been thinking about what you showed me," I replied, which was true in more ways than she realized. The collective consciousness, the ability to experience all possible realities simultaneously. I want to understand it better. Her smile was predatory and satisfied. "Tonight, understanding will be complete. You'll join the others in permanent awareness of the deep state." But as the electrodes were attached and the monitoring systems activated, I began implementing the resonance breaking technique I had studied. Instead of allowing my consciousness to be passively absorbed into the collective network, I actively projected specific brain wave patterns designed to disrupt the integration process. The effect was immediate and dramatic. As my consciousness entered the dimensional space where Dr. Thornfield's laboratory existed, I carried with me frequencies that acted like a virus in the collective system, spreading to the network and reaching the trapped individual consciousnesses of the absorbed volunteers. "What are you doing?" Dr. Thornfield demanded, her form flickering between human and inhuman as the collective network began to destabilize. "You're disrupting the integration protocols." "I'm waking them up," I replied, amplifying the dissonant frequencies through every connection in the network. "I'm giving them back their individual consciousness." The laboratory around us began to collapse as the dimensional framework that supported Dr. Thornfield's operations started to break down. The absorbed volunteers, who had stood passively for so long, began to move independently for the first time in years. Their reflective eyes cleared, individual personality reasserting itself as they remembered who they had been before their absorption. "No!" Dr. Thornfield screamed, her true form now fully visible as a collective network that had sustained her human disguise failed. She was a creature of pure predatory intelligence, a parasite that had learned to mimic human consciousness in order to harvest it more effectively. The collective must be maintained. Individual consciousness is chaos. But it was too late. The resonance-breaking technique had reached critical mass, spreading through every connection in her multidimensional operation. Across multiple realities, absorbed consciousness were breaking free from the collective network, reasserting their individual identity and rejecting the false transcendence they had been promised. Dr. Patterson was the first to fully awaken, his consciousness snapping back to singular awareness, like a rubber band released from tension. "Alex," he said, his voice human again for the first time in months. "What happened?" We're getting out of here," I replied, maintaining the dissonant frequencies that were rapidly destroying the collective network. All of us. The other absorbed volunteers were awakening now, their individual consciousness reasserting itself as the network that had trapped them collapsed. They looked around in confusion and horror, finally understanding what had been done to them, how their consciousness had been harvested and replaced with hollow simulations. Dr. Thornfield made one last desperate attempt to maintain her operation, reaching out with tendrils of pure consciousness to drag us back into the collective network. But individual awareness, once restored, was remarkably resilient. The awakened volunteers joined their mental voices to mine, creating a resonance that completely shattered her multidimensional laboratory. The collapse was spectacular and terrifying. Reality folded in on itself as a dimensional framework that had allowed Dr. Thornfield's operation to exist across multiple timelines simultaneously broke down. The laboratory existed in all states at once, modern and ruined, functional and broken, real and impossible, before finally resolving into a single, definitive state. When the chaos settled, we were lying on hospital beds in a basement room that looked nothing like the sophisticated sleep laboratory I remembered. The equipment was decades old and clearly non-functional. The walls were water-stained and cracking, and the air carried the smell of abandonment and decay. Dr. Thornfield was gone, not dead, but simply absent, as if she had never existed in this particular version of reality. The entity she served had been driven back to whatever dimensional space it inhabited, its local harvesting operation destroyed by the restoration of individual consciousness to its victims. The awakened volunteers needed medical attention. Months or years of existing in a collective consciousness state had taken its toll on their physical bodies. But they were alive, genuinely alive in ways that mattered, their individual awareness restored, and their unique perspectives on reality intact. The official investigation concluded that we had all been victims of an elaborate shared delusion, possibly induced by experimental drugs or psychological manipulation techniques. The basement laboratory was sealed permanently, classified as a safety hazard due to structural instability and potential contamination. But I know the truth. Dr. Thornfield's operation was real, her harvesting of consciousness was real, and the threat she represented continues to exist across multiple dimensions of reality. The entity she served is still out there, looking for new ways to feed on individual awareness, new methods for replacing genuine consciousness with hollow simulations. I've returned to my work in sleep research, but with a different focus now. Instead of studying dreams as manifestations of brain activity, I investigate them as potential gateways to other dimensions of consciousness. I'm teaching other researchers the techniques for recognizing consciousness harvesting operations and defending against them, because the dream that turned into reality taught me something terrifying, but crucial about the nature of existence itself. Individual consciousness is precious beyond measure, worth defending against entities that would consume it, worth preserving even when offered the seductive promise of collective transcendence. The boundary between dreams and reality is indeed fluid, more permeable than most people realize. But on both sides of that boundary, the spark of individual awareness, the unique perspective that makes each consciousness irreplaceable, must be protected. That's the terrifying truth I learned in Dr. Thornfield's laboratory. We are not alone in the universe, but the intelligence we share with sees us not as equals to communicate with, but as resources to be harvested. And vigilance is the price of keeping our dreams and our reality our own.